Oh, thank you so much, Eureka. It's such a pleasure to be here this morning. This conference means a lot to me. I've been thinking a lot about all the programs, initiatives that Eureka and so many people here are involved in, and I have to say Latinx feels like a math home for me, so I'm so pleased to be here. So today I want to talk a little bit about an unexpected journey, I would say. I was teaching statistics, and I wanted to use more real-world data with social relevance, and this kind of journey led to a collaboration with a law professor, with a sociologist, and we've spoken at law conferences about the material. We were able to get disaggregated data from the ACLU of Southern California, data that the LAPD was collecting and making some of it public, but not all, and it's led to projects with undergraduates and other initiatives like that. So math takes us to unexpected places, even to law conferences, for example. The organizers were so kind and asked me to say a little bit about my own path, and so I appreciated that Talitha and others have had photos, so I put up some photos. You'll indulge me. You can hear me speaking quickly. Well, partly I'm excited, partly I'm nervous, partly I'm from the East Coast, from the New York area. But my father is from Iran. He came to the United States when he was around 17 or 18 years old. My mom, well, she's from Brooklyn, but her parents were from Norway, and so also immigrants, and my parents met in New York City. People often say I should have some story about how they met by a fjord in Norway or something dramatic, but it's an American story. They met in New York City. They were in graduate school. My father became a physics professor. My mother had her PhD in French, and so that's one way. I've been very lucky in many respects in my life, and that's one way I was very lucky that even before I knew that there was what I might study or want to study, I knew there was a possibility of college and even something after college, graduate school, even though I wasn't sure exactly what that was. I will say I grew up in a town near New York, but a very homogeneous town, very racially homogeneous, ethnically homogeneous. And some people, I don't know, some people sort of fancy they had pools and tennis courts. And my family, we had chickens and pigeons. And I mentioned that as a love of my father's because I realized with hindsight, my parents, maybe they were teaching me it's okay to do things my own way, do things our own way. Unfortunately, I lost my father when I was in high school. He died unexpectedly, but I had very influential teachers, and I have a hugely supportive mother who wanted to let me pursue my interests. And we all know how influential friends and mentors can be, and we need to be a support to one another. I just want to mention a couple people. I'm not going to narrate all these photos. So there's my mom, by the way. And you can see family on the Norwegian side, on the Iranian side, and so on. I wanted to mention that my high school math teacher, Mr. Cron, was very influential, and I still remember the beginning of my senior year of school. Senior of high school, he said, Lily, I was in this program in the summer. He was doing some professional development for teachers up at Harvard, and they weren't that snobby, actually, after all, and I think you should apply there. And so he planted a huge seed, actually, so I was very lucky. I ended up applying and ended up going there. That was one thing that brought me to Harvard. I have a confession. I started as a chemistry and physics major. But you can guess, math maybe was in my heart, and I actually switched to mathematics. I had a very influential math teacher my first year, in particular, Deborah Hughes Hallett, and she also hired me for my first job, grading and then teaching. And so I also met a graduate student who was a dear friend, and he encouraged me to apply to graduate school in mathematics. So first I was still in college, and then I taught in the night school a little bit, the extension school at Harvard. I spent my summers teaching, and I really enjoyed that. I loved that. I had a chance to study for a term at the University of Oslo, and at any rate, then I headed to Berkeley for graduate school. I was very interested in number theory, beautiful stuff, and so that's what I ended up studying. I want to mention two other big influences. One, solidarity. So Eureka mentioned that I'm very interested in a number of social issues, and I want to say that a lot of my support community has been outside of my math world. Sort of maybe I had my math identity and then my community or activist identity, queer activism, economic justice, civil rights work. We've got a lot to do. At Berkeley, when I got to Berkeley, I didn't know my labor history. I had never been involved in labor, and I was able to be involved in the graduate student movement and learn a lot from the United Auto Workers, the UAW, and learn about building social movements. And I know activism can't just begin and end with marches, but I want to put some happy shots up. So some shots from Pride and elsewhere. Oh, by the way, Dolores Huerta's up there. Did anyone notice? And I will just tell you, if I'm ever tired, I just try to channel some Dolores Huerta, because we marched, and at the end, we were all ready to take a break and sit down, and she wanted to stay and watch the rest of the parade. So I encourage us all to channel her. I just want to mention one other really important category of support for me, and that's been my students and also trailblazers that I've had a chance to meet. My students are future trailblazers. And so when I was at Berkeley, I was involved in something called the Emerging Scholars Program, and my students there were such an inspiration. Some of them are right here right now, actually, very important to me. And this summer at my TAs at Caltech and the Infinite Possibilities Conference. And finally, in the center, the student from Loyola Marymount University, Janine Abiva, now Dr. Abiva, and here she was meeting her hero, someone she'd written a paper about, and then got to meet Dr. Evelyn Boyd Granville, one of the first African-American women in the country to get a PhD in mathematics. So learning my history, my math history, connecting to our future has really been important to me and kept me going on in mathematics. So I would say in general, though, my social justice life and my math life were very separate and distinct issues, number theory and then activism. I hadn't really reconciled them until this unexpected journey. So I just want to mention some collaborators, in particular David Greenberg's in the Department of Sociology at NYU, and also inspiration from others, from the ACLU of Southern California, from legal scholars that introduced me to the LatCrit, the critical race theory legal community, and so on. So I mentioned social justice a couple times, and I realized we never really define it. I'm not going to define it in its full scope, but I do want to say, I kind of was tempted to say, well, I know it when I see it. I know social justice when I see it. Kind of the way that in the 60s, there was a Supreme Court justice who allegedly defined obscenity that way. I know it when I see it. But we're mathematicians. We don't like definitions like that, I think. So I want to take as our launch point that we're aiming for human well-being, improved human well-being. And we could take our cue from the International Council of Science. I'm not going to read this sort of definition, if you will, out loud, but I will say that the ICS, International Council of Science, the International Math Union is a member of that body, and the MAA is a body of the IMU. So in a sense, this is our definition. And maybe I'll just highlight their references to freedom and to health and to bodily well-being. Okay, so what about math itself and social justice? I don't know if anyone's seen this cartoon before. Yes, I hear some people saying yes. So this XKCD comic, so there are fields arranged along one axis, and at each stage, stick figures looking to one side, like the biologist is saying, oh, psychology, that's just applied biology. The chemist is saying biology is just applied chemistry. The physicist declares they're on top. But actually, far to the right is the mathematician, and she's like, oh, hey, I didn't even see you guys way down over there. So this idea that mathematics, some people would argue it's objective, that it's value-free, that it's universal in some sense. And I was trained as a number theorist. I love number theory. So this cartoon makes me laugh. It really resonates with me. But when I look at what we teach and the range of projects and initiatives we can work on, it's hard to argue that what we do is really value-free. I mean, even in number theory with applications to cryptography that can be used for spying, it can be used for human rights work, all sorts of things. So it's hard to argue that what we do is completely free of social implication. And just one little side note, I mean, there are extreme examples out there, so I just want to post this. Many people who look at ethics, even in engineering and other fields, are familiar with this example now of Bonnie Schulman's, but a really outrageous example that came from textbooks. In particular, this is about gassing people. So in Germany, from a high school textbook, and I'm not even going to read this example out loud. It's quite disgusting. But we shouldn't assume that textbooks in the United States didn't also move at the same time to change during the war effort. And I don't know how many people read the book Hidden Figures, this amazing story about the history of hidden African-American women at NASA. But I remember within it a reference to the fact that the curriculum in grade schools and high schools was being modified to support the war effort, even looking at budgeting and household budgets and production and so on. So I guess my point is what we teach reflects what we're prioritizing and valuing as a society in our culture. And even though we might say, oh, that was so long ago, that's not now, I pulled this example, this was in the news, from Los Angeles elementary school last year. I don't want you to think this is representative of all word problems in Los Angeles. There was a huge stir about this and outrage, but I think it's fair to say that so these examples aren't from just long ago, and they're not focused on human well-being. So we can do better than this. And so let's actually look at the issue of racial profiling in particular. Mathematicians, we like definitions, so let's start with a definition. And I'm going to use the following, so just give me a moment to straighten here. In particular, so from the US Department of Justice, we have the following language, and in particular, police action, the action of law enforcement, is not supposed to be based on identity, so supposed to be based on race or ethnicity or national origin, but instead on the behavior of an individual. So if law enforcement takes action based on an individual's behavior, or if they have a very, very specific suspect description, they're allowed to take action. But in general, law enforcement action that's based on identity is prohibited by the Department of Justice. It's against their guidelines. Well, it is prohibited, but most Americans actually think it's still happening, and there have been numerous polls over the years, Gallup polls and so on, that show people believe that profiling happens. And it's so prevalent that there's this nickname, so just like a DWI, driving while intoxicated, many people have heard this coinage DWB for driving while black or brown to capture this phenomenon. And you can see this political cartoon here of a police officer with a radar gun, instead of checking the speed, assessing the identity of the driver or passengers. And so where does statistics come in? Well, I want to point out that there were some seminal court cases in the 1990s, one in New Jersey, one in Maryland, and they were looking at drivers along the I-95, the Interstate 95 corridor along the eastern seaboard, along the East Coast. And a statistician, actually a psychologist and then statistician, John Lamberth, decided to collect expert evidence to conduct what we'll call rolling surveys along the highway. So having a driver plus an observer in the car driving at the speed limit. Well, if you drive at the speed limit and someone passes you, then they're speeding. And if you pass someone, they're not speeding. And so from that, the observer tried to make note of the perceived race or ethnicity of the drivers who were speeding and of the non-speeders, and then from that have sort of a benchmark, a snapshot, if you will, of the speeding population of I-95. Interstate 95, and they found that indeed police were stopping African-American drivers at a significantly higher rate, significantly in every sense, so in a sense of statistical significance and also just a much higher rate than white drivers. And what's really notable about these cases is that there was a lot of evidence, other evidence introduced about police training and so on, but police practice, but the statistical evidence was received by the court and part of what they really weighed in their findings. Okay, so let's turn to Los Angeles. I mean, I'm naturally interested in Los Angeles, my home, it's important to me. But why would we want to study Los Angeles in general? Well, it's a large city, second largest city in the US, has a very diverse population. And in particular, in the 1990s, there were a series of profound concerns raised about policing in the city. There was a scandal involving the Rampart Division. There was an anti-gang unit that was found actually planting evidence on suspects. Many court cases were overturned, and this, along with other abuses, the net result was the signing of a consent decree with the US Department of Justice. And there are many aspects to the consent decree, monitoring police practice in different ways, but one of them was a large-scale data collection effort. And so for every traffic and every pedestrian stop that the LAPD conducted, they recorded information about the stop. So we'll say a little bit more about that. This decree, this was in the early 2000s. It was originally just supposed to go on for some number of years. It was extended by a judge for an extra 5 years, but it's now expired. And at the end, maybe I'll say a little bit about newer data collection that's coming down the pike. But I want to say one more thing about traffic stops. We're going to be talking about what I call routine traffic stops, but really the way that most people have interactions with the police is through a traffic stop. So every few years, the Bureau of Justice Statistics does studies about police-civilian interactions, and if we can understand traffic stops, we're actually getting a window into most policing in some sense. And fortunately, with the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, we're really seeing a lot more, but today we're going to focus more narrowly on what I'll call routine traffic stops. One more comment about the LAPD and public perception. So I mentioned the Rampart scandal, and that's the fact that police were found planting evidence. And so you can see this cartoon. So in the backdrop, there's someone on the ground, he's been shot. It appears the police are dropping a gun and a bag of something, maybe drugs, to plant evidence. But meanwhile, in the front, this was Chief Bratton, for many years the chief of police in Los Angeles, and he's looking squeaky clean in front of the cameras and smiling for the cameras. The reason I put this in is this is from an LAPD training manual, meaning that the police were aware that there's a serious problem. There's the problem of the actions of the police, but also public perception and the erosion of trust, especially in communities of color. And so, this shows significance of the serious trust issues that were recognized globally. Okay, so what is our data source? I mentioned the police would collect data for traffic stops, in particular driver and pedestrian stops. So this is an image on the side of a field data report. So initially the police were bubbling information about traffic stops, and later they moved to handheld electronic devices. But essentially they were collecting some crude information for each traffic stop. For example, was there a driver, passenger, or pedestrian who was stopped? What was the perceived race or ethnicity of the person who was stopped, their gender recorded as a binary, their rough age range, and so on. They also recorded information about the reason for the stop, the basis. Was it a moving violation, equipment violation, and so on? What happened during the stop? For example, was somebody frisked? Was a search conducted? And then was there any outcome in particular? Was a ticket issued? Was someone arrested? Did nothing happen? Did nothing happen at all? So for example, if we zoom in for a moment, and again, the form may not be so visible, but I want to say that I mentioned searches. Information is collected not just about whether or not a search happened, but what the legal basis was for the search. And we'll return to this, but in general, if a car is stopped, for example, an officer can't just choose to search. They need probable cause or some legal basis. So that could include visible contraband if they think they see something, or odor of contraband if they smell something. It could also include parole or probation status, the driver. It could also include simply driver consent or pedestrian consent. So we'll come back to that. All right, so here's the situation. We have these field data reports. The LAPD was publishing every 6 months or so aggregated tallies, just big tables online, not of individual stop data, but tallies. How many people were stopped? How many people that they had identified as African American, as Latino, and so on. And it looked like no one was really looking at this data or studying it. Thanks to the ACLU of California and some early work we did, we were able to get access to disaggregated data. But we're talking about hundreds and thousands of stops every year, over 600,000 driver stops roughly, and over 200,000 pedestrian stops. So actually, maybe I'll pose the question, like, what would you do if you just knew the number of stops, let's say, of drivers? Where would you begin? Anyone want to pipe up?
Cluster analysis.
Cluster, okay, that's a fancier place to begin. And I'm going to begin somewhere simpler, because actually, because most people begin somewhere simpler, they look at census data. So actually, I'm just going to start with that. We're probably going to critique it in a moment, but so I'm going to start with census data, census and stops. So actually, it's a very large room, but you have neighbors. So I'd like to take a moment. Do you want to grab a neighbor? And I'd like you to see if there anything that stands out from the data. It's just a bar graph, and in particular, the blue bars represent the 2010 census data. Now, this is kind of conflating race and ethnic categories, but at any rate, if we take this crude checkbox system, and everyone goes into just one box. Roughly speaking, the population of Los Angeles, the demographics are described by the blue boxes. And then if you look at who was stopped in the year, I should say this data is from 2008 because that's the last year for which we have really robust and complete data set from the LAPD, and where they released, we were able to get access to many layers of the data. So I'm serious, it's a large room, but let's go for it. Grab a neighbor. All right, it's so good to hear the conversation in the room. So I haven't planted anyone, but I am curious to hear what people found. Does anyone want to pipe up? What's something that stood out?
African American style.
Yeah, and I heard, actually, I was starting to listen in, I even asked some groups. And so, what do you notice about African American drivers? African Americans represent about 10% of the population of the city of Los Angeles, but actually are stopped at a rate that's essentially double that. Did other people did that finding stick out? Yeah, okay. Anything else? Just from this innocent little bar graph.
The likelihood of that seems surprisingly low.
Yeah, so it almost seems like if African Americans are overstopped relative to the driving population, it's as though Latinos are understopped. Yeah, those are the two things that stood out to me. Those are the two things that stood out to my students. And so we might, we want to step back and kind of figure out, well, what's up with census data and this, what is this telling us? But it's probably fair to say that if the bars had all lined up, that is within each racial and ethnic group, representation of the population and representation among stops had lined up, our story might have ended here, even though there might have been more to look at for policing. The judge might not have extended the consent decree. And instead, we see that there's some disparities that invite explanation, invite more study. So I'll just say there's a difficulty in finding an appropriate benchmark to compare stops to. So Los Angeles itself, well, let me go to a map of LA. LA is a sprawl. It's around 400 square miles, and this color coding is for policing districts, about 18. Actually, there are 20 of them now. It's been slightly divided up a little differently. And so this idea of just taking the census data, well, you can see LA is surrounded by and adjacent to other communities. The census data is only capturing the city of LA. And actually, in general, census data tends to, for example, to undercount underrepresented groups. Well, that wouldn't really explain the disparity for African American drivers and stops. On the other hand, census data doesn't capture the driving population necessarily at all. Who has a car, who has access to the city. Actually, even who's driving into the city, the driving population of LA, LA is an employment center, doesn't necessarily match the census data population. So let me just list some of these issues. So census data doesn't capture the driving population. I mentioned that rolling survey that was done, the studies along the I-95 corridor, but I showed that map of LA and I declared it to be 400 square miles. Are we going to conduct rolling surveys throughout the city? There's not really a great way to capture data like that. Someone might say, well, let's go to DMV data, focus just on drivers, but that's going to omit unlicensed drivers. And also, as I mentioned, there are many drivers entering the city from elsewhere. Some smaller municipalities have been able to use DMV data and to get at this issue. But I guess my point is census data is problematic. Of course, it's not my point. Scholars on both the left and the right would take issue with using census data. So our alternative is, well, we saw those field data reports, and I mentioned that a wide variety of data is gathered, not just whether or not a stop was conducted. And so it raises natural questions. Well, why don't we look at what happens after a stop? And in some sense, we could use the stops themselves as a benchmark or some pool to analyze and look at the post-stop outcomes. So we're not completely getting at the DWB question, why was someone stopped, but we're still getting an eye into police practice. And actually, I'd argue, if we start looking at things like searches, maybe we're looking at a very important part of the story. Not all stops are equivalent. And searches are very important because they're intrusive, they're more time consuming, they really change the tenor of a traffic stop. So first, let me just say something about search rates in LA overall. So we're just gonna get a feel for the data overall. So I mentioned on the order of, or over 600,000 driver stops, over 200,000 pedestrian stops in a given year. And these are just the search rates. So once someone is stopped, likelihood of either a car being searched or a person. Now, frisks are technically slightly different than searches. If anyone's curious afterwards, we can talk about that. But this is the category of searches, and it could include emptying pockets. It could include looking at a car. So the overall search rate in LA, almost 24%. Let me just say that's high. If we look at national figures, nationally, we'd expect to see something much lower. We'd expect to see something more on the order of 3 to 5% for drivers, based on Bureau of Justice Statistics data. We'd expect something higher for pedestrians, but maybe even on the order of 20%, that high nationally. But what do you see here? So I said, first of all, for drivers, less than 5%. In LA, it's over 11. And for pedestrians, I said almost 20%. This is almost 50. So the LAPD is searching at a very high rate overall in comparison to national statistics. All right, so we're, of course, I'm very interested in seeing what's happening in terms of race and ethnicity. We saw those census bars and they caught our eye. So let's start this journey. Let's take a look at search rates by race and ethnicity. And we're gonna look first at drivers only, and then for some statistics for pedestrians, because those are very different pools. But I will say in LA, they say car is king. This is a city that likes people like to drive. So if we look at even just drivers, we're getting a snapshot in. Okay, so the red bar represents that overall search rate. We already know that's much higher than the national average. And I don't know, should I ask again, does anything stand out in this graph? Yeah, 2 of these bars are much higher than any other. In particular, for African American and Latino drivers, the search rates are significantly higher. I'll point out that, for example, for white drivers, it says 4.2%. Actually, that kind of mirrors the national data. So the experience of white drivers is in step in some sense with the national experience of policing, far higher for drivers of color. And of course, I've listed these as percentages, but sometimes it's useful to think in terms of frequencies as well. If African Americans are almost 4 times as likely to be searched as white drivers, for example, on the order of 1 in 6 African American drivers. So 6 people are stopped, 1 is already searched, and an even higher rate for Latino drivers. So we can plainly see that the experience of drivers of color is very different from that of in particular white drivers and drivers in general. A few comments. By the way, this category of other is, the police get to just check other. And it's not always clear who's in that category and who's out. For example, sometimes they'll code in more information. They'll write something in, and it's clear the person was Middle Eastern, but maybe some Middle Easterners are counted as white. Actually raises an interesting question. Of course, this resonates with me as an Iranian American, but I read a quote once that said Middle Easterners in the United States are white, but their whiteness can be revoked at any moment. And I thought that was very, very interesting. Okay, so 2 comments about search rates in general, and the data we'll look at today. This is citywide. Rates do vary by parts of the city, and LA, like most American cities, is very segregated residentially, fairly segregated. So I'll say in general, if we do a deeper dive into the data, in communities of color, it's true that search rates are higher, but for all drivers in communities of color. And in all parts of the city, so regardless of the part of the city, drivers of color are searched more. So in other words, this disparity isn't just the result of heavier policing in some parts of Los Angeles. And so second comment I want to make about statistical significance. So these are bar graphs, and the data sets are very large. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of stops. So it's fair to say we don't really need to formally test significance to conclude that there are profound disparities here. And so maybe what I'm going to say is if it quacks like a duck, it's a duck. If it looks like there's a disparity, then it's a statistically significant one. But I will say when I was first looking at data like this, I was working with students, and we were learning about, for example, mechanics of hypothesis testing, or testing for difference of proportions, for example. And so we had a general activity, and for those of you who are doing statistics or teaching it or taking it, you can measure how likely something is to, let me say, you can construct a test statistic. So how many standard deviations is some statistic from the mean? And if my students were used to something being, I don't know, maybe 2 or even 3 standard deviations from the mean, if it was more than 4, whoa, jump back, something surprising had happened, something that was very improbable to have happened by chance. Had happened. And I almost wish I'd put up some sample computations, but we were working with data like this, and students, we worked on something in this so-called z-score that if it's bigger than 4, we're surprised, popped out. It was 88. And there was an audible gasp across the room. Now, this is partly an artifact of the size of the data sets, but it was an audible gasp. And I will say that as an educator, I knew when I heard that gasp that the mechanics of hypothesis testing had been captured. And the disparities were so large, they were literally off the chart. And I don't want us to leave thinking, 88 is much more significant than it had been 60 or 5 or 4, but off the chart. And I promise you, if you work with data like this, students who are familiar with hypothesis testing, they will be shocked. And as we should be. And one time I had a group working on an activity, and I knew they were ahead of the other group, so I came over to check in. But then they shooed me away. They're like, no, something's wrong. We've done something wrong in setting up which proportions we're looking at. Like, shooed me away. And I knew what had happened. They had done things just right, and it was just too surprising. Okay, so I'm just briefly going to say something about pedestrians. The search rates are very high in the city of Los Angeles. In New York, stop and frisk treatment of pedestrians has gotten a lot of attention. We might swing back to that, but let me just say the overall rate is extremely high. Around half of pedestrians are searched, and it's it's in some sense it's high across the board. It's high across the board relative to national averages, but yet again, Latinos and African Americans are disproportionately impacted by these rates. So it raises the question, what's happening with searches? So I want to go back to this field data report, and I mentioned that it's not just indicated whether a search happened or not, but what the basis for the search was. There has to be a legal basis for a search, and for example, I mentioned parole status or visible contrabands. And one of those criteria that I mentioned could be consent. So a driver or a pedestrian can grant consent to a search. And so it raises a question, can we look at searches and see what the basis for the search was, and is there anything that will tell us a story there? And I will say there's almost nothing in the legal literature about empirical studies of consent. Many people are interested in the legal issue of consent, but having empirical data around it is much more rare. Most traffic and pedestrian stops may not even involve a search to begin with, but the search rates in LA are so high that there's a high fraction of searches where consent was the only basis. So actually, let me say one more thing about consent in the law. Searching with consent is an important tool from the policing perspective, because if someone grants consent, someone's essentially waiving their Fourth Amendment rights. That is, if any evidence or contraband is turned up, then it's hard to argue against admitting that at a trial for a defendant. And seek and you shall find. If you search lots of people in Los Angeles, you're going to find stuff, by the way. At the same time, consent-based searches, they have the potential for abuse if they're purely discretionary. And if they're just determined by the discretion of the officer. Because these searches are purely discretionary, consent searches are really of great concern to community activists, but also to civil libertarians and also to Fourth Amendment scholars. So I want to keep in mind that this category of consent and the use of consent is one where officers have great discretion, and there's a lot of interest in scrutinizing policing. So I'm just going to put up a table of numbers, and again, we're just going to look at citywide data and get a feel for rates. And so let me say something about this table first, or the idea of consent. There are lots of questions you could ask about consent just from the numbers. You could say, well, what fraction of drivers is asked to consent to a search to begin with? Let's focus just on drivers from here out. You could ask what fraction says yes? Who says yes to a search? What fraction of searches occur where consent was in fact one of the bases for the search? And then we could say, are there searches, can we look at the searches where consent was in fact the only basis? Again, the searches where officers have the most discretion. So each of these columns in this table represents one of those questions that I just posed. And so, for example, and grouped by racial and ethnic category. So for example, I don't know, if we looked at the second row, let's say the second row, the first column, where there's just a 3.0. So that means that of Asian drivers, 3% of them were asked to consent to a search. And so in this way, we could read each entry in the table. And so maybe I'm going to actually, let me come back to the table. If we were to look just at the first column, it's easier to see visual data. Let's just look at a graph. So these are the rate at which consent is asked by race and ethnicity, but they're ordered in increasing order, not in alphabetical order by category. And I guess I'm not going to ask what stands out, but we can see there's an overall search rate, and then Latinos and African Americans are searched at a much higher rate. Yes. So let me go back actually to the table, and I am curious. I mean, it's a spread of numbers, but I'm wondering if any column looks very different than the others, and if so, which one? I don't like calling people by name, but Helen, I wasn't sure if you were nodding and saying that, but did...
So there are an awful lot of 90s and 70s.
Yeah, okay, does the second column, the day in the second column looks, thank you. I didn't ask you ahead of time to say that, did I? No, I didn't, okay. The second column looks very different from the other column. So what was that capturing? If consent was asked, who says yes, who acquiesces? And I mean, maybe not surprisingly, even though it turns out legally one can decline, very few drivers do. It's fair to say that in the various ways that we looked at the data, not just these overall tallies, this was one of the only questions one could ask or look at where there wasn't the same profound disparity along racial and ethnic lines. And so that raises the question, what is consent? What does consent mean if virtually everyone says yes? Can we assume that's voluntary? maybe the most conservative reading is to say these numbers are so high that we don't have any evidence that drivers know that they can decline. That might be the mildest reading of this. Police might argue that there are high consent rates because of a desire on the part of the public to comply with law enforcement. And with rates that are over 90 or 95%, that's probably not really a credible claim. Okay, I want to jump to the fourth column now. So these were searches conducted where consent was the only basis. So meaning driver was stopped, and in the course of the stop, an officer decided to obtain consent for a search, and then conducted a search. These were the fraction of the searches where consent was in fact the only basis for the search. And these, as I mentioned, these are the searches that raise the most sort of Fourth Amendment concern and interest among legal scholars. And we see, again, for African Americans and Latino drivers in particular, I mean, almost 30% of the searches that were conducted were really discretionary, but this is the only basis. For other groups, still many consent-based searches, heavy use of consent, but less than a quarter or even a fifth of the searches relying on consent. This overall pattern, the numbers are different, the overall patterns we see relative to one another carry over, they're similar for pedestrians. So here's the thing, if there's a search, it's natural to ask if anything is found. My students are very curious about this. What kind of discoveries are made? And a discovery does not legally retroactively justify a search. It doesn't make it a legal search, but scholars, again, on the left and on the right have said, well, this is some way to gauge what is the threshold police are using for searching. Sometimes they call this a discovery rate or a hit rate. And so I'd like us to take a little look at discoveries, at least briefly. And again, I'm not going through the mechanics of, we're not going to go through the mechanics of statistical significance testing, but let's get an overall snapshot. So I've labeled these as non-vehicular discoveries. What do I mean by that? Well, on this form, an officer can check off a discovery that could include a vehicle, but you don't need to search to discover a vehicle. You don't need a search, for example, if there's a registration issue, that doesn't require a search. If we exclude cases where a vehicle was the so-called discovery, and most searches don't turn anything up, but about 20% of searches overall, and about only 12%, so a far smaller fraction of these consent-only based searches, the ones, again, with great officer discretion, are turning up discoveries. And so even though in the literature people usually look at a discovery or hit rate, I want to say the natural complement to that is a miss rate. Right? If you don't find anything, there's a miss. So I'd like us to take a moment to look at miss rates. And I want to look at searches overall, and again, these consent-based searches. So this data is, again, grouped by race and ethnicity. And across the board, we see that most searches don't turn up anything. But very consistently, well, I should say very consistently, except in this case, the pool of Native American drivers stopped was quite small. So I haven't labeled, I apologize, haven't put information about the population sizes here. But at any rate, in general, consent-based searches are even less likely to turn something up. They're misses much more of the time. And the miss rate is notably higher for African Americans and Latinos. And now sometimes people ask, well, what kind of discoveries are made? People are often very concerned about weapon discoveries or gun discoveries, for example. Someone might say, well, even if you only find something 10 or 20% of the time, if it's a weapon, that's of interest. And I just want to say weapons are found in less than 1% of consent-based searches. In one period, over 16,000 drivers who were searched, fewer than 100, maybe 94 weapons. And in this case, weapon doesn't necessarily mean a gun. It could mean a knife. It could mean a bat. It could mean something else. So this is not an effective way to be looking for weapons in general. Similarly, out of pedestrian searches, a very low rate. Maybe I'll just put up similar companion bar graphs for pedestrian searches in general. Again, high miss rates, but even higher when consent was the only basis for the search. I also want to make the comment, so I haven't broken down the type of discovery. My students are often very interested in drug discoveries in particular. There's a lot of stereotyping about drugs, and it's, as I mentioned, I don't mean to be flip, but seek and you shall find. If you search a lot of drivers, you start to turn stuff up. But drug discoveries are, in Los Angeles, they're much higher for white drivers than for any other group, and then for Asian drivers. I mean, perhaps not unsurprisingly, there's an over-searching of African Americans and Latinos. And now, I don't want to create the impression that race and ethnicity are the only variables affecting search rates, and and searching in the city. And let me just mention, so search it's a binary outcome. Either there's a search or not. It can be coded as a 0 and 1. And so you can set up a logistic regression model and look at other variables that might weigh in. And let me just say that in any model that we've looked at, various data, pulling in crime data from other areas, race and ethnicity always prove to be significant, variables. They're by no means the only significant variables. As a concrete example, gender. Men are much more likely to be searched than women. This data is coded in a binary way. But again, with these tools, even taking into account other factors, race and ethnicity continue to be significant. There are other observations we can make in general. For example, age as a variable. In general, search rates, they're monotonically decreasing. Oh, I wanted to say that. As pedestrians get older, they're less likely to be searched. There's a very interesting study, work done in Kansas by some legal experts, showing that African-American men age out of this more slowly. That is, older African-American men are more likely to be searched in the way that young men of other racial and ethnic groups are. And that bears out in the LA data as well, with respect to searches of pedestrians in particular. Okay, so I'm not going to say so much about logistic regression, but let me say, where does this leave us? Where does it leave us? Because I started with a call to action, and you know a little bit about what makes me tick. So where does this leave us legally? So in New York City, there were a series of 4 court cases, very significant cases in recent years around police practice. And one of them in particular, the Floyd case, was about the stop and frisk policies of the NYPD. Over a number of years, crime rates have been on the decline, by the way, I should say, in New York City for many, many years. But over a number of years, frisk rates were steadily increasing to the point at their peak that so many young black men in New York were frisked, Latino men too, but in the demographic of younger African-American males, in a given year, it was as though every single man in that demographic had been searched in the city. Every single one. Now, of course, not every single person was searched. That means there were young black men who were searched again and again and again over the course of the year. So the judge was looking at the statistics. There was a data collection effort there. This is the data that the police themselves are collecting, I should say. But at one point, it's reported in the press, so Shira Scheindlin presided over these cases, and she was looking at discovery rates, the type of data that we were looking at. And she said, if you reasonably suspect something and you're wrong, 90% of the time, that raises the question, well, it should raise it for all of us. What constitutes reasonable suspicion? How reasonable are you being if you're wrong 90% of the time? And again, I want to emphasize, when we restrict in this way to searches where consent was the only basis, we're looking at just the searches where officers are really exercising their own discretion. We're also excluding the potential that some other context of the stop or behavior of the driver pedestrian explains these racial and ethnic disparities. So we've seen significant disparities. They're exacerbated by the application of these consent-only searches. And we've seen that the majority of these searches are fruitless, and they're when I say the majority, I don't just mean over 50%, I mean on the scale that Judge Scheindlin was perturbed by. Sometimes people will speculate that searching has a deterrent effect, but as far as I can tell from looking in the literature, this is purely speculative. And in the meantime, there's so many stops conducted, something that is measurable is the time that's being taken from the intrusion of these searches. We could measure that if we wanted to. Okay, so where does that leave us, just to wrap up and be mindful of the time? There's a lot to say and continue to look at about policing, but what if we were just to make very narrow recommendations based on just the little slice that we've seen? The first thing we might do is say maybe we should prohibit the use of consent when that's the only basis for a search. Those were the very searches that were less likely to turn anything up. There wasn't any other form of probable cause. It might sound a little pie in the sky, like why would the police give up a tool like that? But it's actually not without precedent to do so. The California Highway Patrol, for some period of time, because of some response to some litigation, banned consent-only searches. So if a prohibition like this, I mean, it could be through a change in police policy, but it could also be through broader legislation. So food for thought. What else? Well, we saw that most people, this is a column Helen pointed out, most people don't decline a search. So I'm wondering how many people have heard, like, you have the right to remain silent, a Miranda warning. So either because of this famous court case, the Miranda court case, or because we've been watching too much Law and Order, but heard the Miranda warning. And people are aware too, probably to a greater degree, if somebody shows up at your house, at your home, and wants to enter, you could say, well, do you have a warrant? But the data points to the fact that we don't have something equivalent knowledge about searches of cars. The legal landscape for searching a car is a different standard than for a home. Officer doesn't need a warrant. But the idea that you could decline if there wasn't probable cause, that's clearly not in the popular knowledge. So could someone be made aware of the right to refuse? Could there be maybe someone signing a consent form? Now that's not a panacea. I'm not saying that if people knew they could decline, suddenly these search rates would fall. But these are all pieces of the puzzle, pieces that the data points to. Finally, I want to note that when there are abuses, when there are issues that come up in policing, some of them, there's no way to raise them through a legal mechanism unless they rise to the level of a court case. And this is one of these examples. In particular, as things stand, unless a situation rises to a level where someone's evidence is found and maybe presented in court and someone's trying to challenge that, there isn't a basis for challenging the validity of these searches. And so providing a mechanism for that somehow through, for example, the local city government, that could be desirable, especially for building greater trust and giving a voice to what's happening. So what can we do next? Just to be very broad, I mentioned that in New York there were these rising stop and frisk rates. Well, if we find the police reporting credible, through public pressure, they've really declined dramatically. Through this entire rise and fall, crime rates have been falling. They're not well correlated at all. They're not correlated at all with the frisk patterns in New York. So there was very strong coalition community building work that happened in New York City between community activists and academics, in particular at John Jay College and elsewhere, and legal groups like the Center for Constitutional Rights and the New York CLU, the ACLU of New York. So that kind of web of action, so not just community activists, not just the legal scholars, but bringing everyone together, that could be important for reforming practice. There's a new wave of data coming. So I mentioned this consent decree and that there's a large set of data, but it expired at some point. The police were no longer collecting data, and even in those last years, making public only sparse pieces, for example, none of the consent information. But coming to California, so through legislation in the Assembly and Senate, there are going to be statewide data collection reporting happening. Different police departments will handle this in different ways, and the largest departments are best equipped to implement new reporting standards. And so LA is allegedly going to be rolling out in July of 2018. That doesn't mean they'll be immediately reporting in 2018, but we need to cast an eye to, I think the data tells a story. I hope at a minimum that we're hearing that. And so, meanwhile, in many other states, including Connecticut, my home state, there's public data. I encourage you to look online and check it out. Have your students, as students we can analyze it, as educators we can analyze it. And finally, I just wanted to say that I started on this journey in hopes, in part of inspiring, maybe radicalizing my own students. But through the course of this, they sometimes come to me to share their own stories. And of course, what's happened is that I'm the one who got inspired. I'm the one who's been radicalized. So I thank you for listening today. I hope if there are questions, we can swing to those. But I just wanted to say thank you very much.